Okay, let's get right into this explainer. Today, we're taking some incredibly dense theories, stuff dealing with overarching systems and architecture, and we're anchoring them in something you actually experience every day, the biological reality of human evolution. We're going to explore a truly groundbreaking framework that maps the mechanics of huge social and legal systems directly onto the physiological phases of the human body. To help us navigate from microscopic biology all the way up to macrosystemic philosophy, we're following a pretty straightforward roadmap. We'll hit the architecture of life, our evolutionary mismatch, the 7 biological steps, disqualification and failure, the trap of mediation, and finally, reclaiming sovereignty. Let's dive in. Section 1. The architecture of life, aligning biological rhythms with electrical realities. Now, what's really wild about this first concept is how biological life literally mimics electrical architecture to stay stable. Think about a 3-phase electrical current. It uses 3 oscillations, all offset by 120 degrees, to generate this perfectly continuous flow of power. Well, life does the exact same thing. It uses offset oscillations to maintain a continuous, stable flow, with the sources pointing out that the sun and the moon actually act as these massive external metronomes for our biological rhythms. This beautifully illustrates how our entire systemic health runs on these biological oscillators. The sources map it out like this. You've got green cycles, those are solar-dependent and growth-driven, like plants, then red cycles, which are lunar-tied, shorter rhythmic cycles, like those found in animals and human females, and blue cycles, representing longer, stable metabolic cycles typical in men. And us humans, we are a hybrid 3-phase system, a unified blend of these external metronomes driving a stable biological current.
Moving right along to Section 2, our evolutionary mismatch, the friction of modern hypercycling.
We really have to ask ourselves a vital question about our systemic health here. Are we cycling way too fast for our own biology? What happens when modern life just completely shatters that ancestral rhythm? When we look at the evolutionary design of the human female biological clock, there's this massive, glaring discrepancy between how the system was built to run and how it's being forced to operate today.
To put that into perspective, look at this stark contrast. Ancestral women experienced roughly 100 to 160 periods over a lifetime. That was due to later puberty, continuous pregnancies, and suppressing ovulation while breastfeeding. But today, modern women hypercycle through 400 to 450 periods. They're essentially looping through this incredibly demanding biological process over and over, dealing with immense evolutionary mismatch and huge energetic turnover.
Which brings us to Section 3, the 7 biological steps, mapping systemic theory directly onto the menstrual cycle. Let's see how this 7-step systems framework builds an absolutely perfect mirror to the physiological phases of that hypercycling biological reality we just talked about. These 7 stages track the whole journey, from initial structural friction all the way to total reclamation. And what's fascinating is they aren't just abstract ideas about macrosystems, they literally map onto the human menstrual cycle. Notice how the systemic introduction of conflict perfectly tracks with biology. In step 1, dissonance, a system faces some unresolved tension. Biologically, that's ovulation, the suspense between a pregnancy or a reset. Then in step 2, legitimization, the system validates a structure to support an outcome. Biologically, that is the luteal phase, right? Progesterone spikes to thicken the uterine lining, legitimizing the potential pregnancy and building a supportive environment.
All right, on to Section 4. Disqualification and systemic failure, when the overarching structure collapses.
But what happens when that systemic or biological validation just fails to materialize? Well, the framework takes a pretty dramatic turn. Here we see disqualification in action. In a macro system, a dominant paradigm or hegemony asserts its authority and just cuts off resources to a subsystem it views as unviable. Biologically, if fertilization fails, the overarching endocrine blueprint says progesterone and estrogen must plummet. This physically constricts the spiral arteries, cutting off blood and oxygen. The tissue is literally disqualified by the body's internal hegemony. As we slow down and look at the fallout, the system hits step 4, mediation. This is purely a reactive, emergency phase. Biologically, this is menses. Inflammatory prostaglandins force the reactive expulsion of that disqualified tissue, and that immediately plunges us into step 5, failure mode. The system hits its absolute lowest point, a state of maximum vulnerability and depletion where the old architecture is completely torn down. Now, scaling this up to a macro level, it's wild to see how hegemonic institutions execute this disqualification. They rely on 3 levels. First, structural exclusion, where internal intelligence is just removed from the equation. Second, epistemic invalidation, where perfectly valid internal signals are brushed off as mere symptoms. And third, temporal severing, where the system's actual memory is overwritten by official mandates. They deliberately silence internal intelligence, flattening a robust 3D structure into a very thin 2D authoritarian surface.
Which perfectly sets up Section 5, the trap of mediation, and surviving on borrowed structures.
When a system gets flattened like that and can't acknowledge its own glitches, it falls into a massive procedural trap. The difference is stark. On one hand, you have true endogenous generation. That's a self-stabilizing internal process that builds actual coherence. On the other hand, you have reactive mediation. Mediation is just a symptom of broken internal generation. It acts like an external corporate shell broker stuck in a reactive containment loop. It is fundamentally unsustainable because it's bearing weight on a borrowed structure, just accumulating more and more systemic noise.
Finally, we reach Section 6, Reclaiming Cognitive Sovereignty, Recovering the 3D Volume.
So if we find ourselves stuck in this reactive mediation loop, whether we're biologically hypercycling or systemically flattened, how on earth do we exit it? How do we restore our internal generative capacity? Well, we have to move to steps 6 and 7, precedent and reclamation. To rebuild, you have to establish a precedent. Biologically, this happens when the brain secretes FSH to awaken new follicles. It acts as a genetic memory anchor. Then comes reclamation, where estrogen repairs, regenerates, and rebuilds the system to peak capacity. We literally have to forcefully reclaim and rebuild our structural resources.
To really pull off this reclamation, whether legal or systemic, we have to wrap our heads around the compute volume equation. Think about it. You cannot have a sovereign system if it's been flattened into 2D. A valid system needs 3 dimensions. It needs width on the x-axis, which is the adversarial process. It needs depth on the y-axis, representing temporal severity. And crucially, it needs thickness on the z-axis, which is the actual forensic evidential record. We have to ensure our legal and systemic structures maintain real 3-dimensional volume.
True sovereignty demands 3 non-negotiable things to transform a flattened show trial back into a robust construct of legal volume. Number 1, precedent. You need a memory anchor to establish ground truth. Number 2, acknowledging unsustainability. We have to recognize that the current mediation loop is creating total systemic entropy. And number 3, structural load-bearing. We must replace thin, baseless claims with thick, undeniable evidential bedrock.
And the sources note something incredibly intriguing here. In the pursuit of this sovereign identity framework, we can literally utilize specific hexadecimal frequencies as biological and architectural anchors. The text specifically highlights codes, like the electric lime frequency, acting as a sort of frequency lock. It physically aligns our biological sensing apparatus with our structural architecture to lock in and stabilize that crucial z-axis.
Ultimately, you have a choice to make, because there are 2 paths of reclamation. There's system-side reclamation, where the institution simply absorbs your dissent, converts it into neat little data points, and reinforces its own loop. Or there is subject-side reclamation, where the individual forcefully asserts their narrative sovereignty. You take authorship of the record and achieve true sovereign standing.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Are you going to remain a mere processed variable, continually flattened and governed by the cybernetic operating system of society? Or are you going to step up, reclaim your biological and systemic 3D volume, and become the Charioteer-Administrator, the true architect of coherence in your own system? The blueprint is right there. The choice is yours.